Okay, so this is the 9th session of the course on existentialism, and I think it's the 4th, might even be the 5th session on Sartre. I've now forgotten. And what we're going to do today is begin to move from the discussions of the reflective and pre-reflective that we first started on in Transcendence of the Ego. We're going to go through another kind of interesting place in which this is used prior to being a nothingness, which is in a text called The Emotions, Outline of a Theory, or sometimes Sketch for a Theory of the Emotions. And so we're going to look at that. That's a book that's in 3 chapters. The first chapter is a kind of critique of standard psychology, the second of psychoanalysis, and the third is a kind of sketch of what he calls a phenomenological theory of the emotions. And so we're going to kind of move from transcendence of the ego through the emotions and sort of connect up to being and nothingness. And the idea of this is to try and pursue kind of some of the lines of thinking that Sartre had that developed in transcendence of the ego, and then begin to take a particular direction in being and nothingness, a direction I think perhaps is probably a cul-de-sac. I'm not sure it necessarily goes anywhere interesting. If I think last session or the session before, I mentioned that he kind of Sartre rejects later on in life, in the 1968 interview, he rejects or puts aside the use of the idea of a subject. And so by the time he gets to his later sort of 60s, the position he's had in being a nothingness has kind of been moved away from. But actually, there's some interesting kind of threads of connection that throughout Sartre's work, I think, that kind of begin in Transcendence of the Ego and can be developed differently. Part of the background to thinking that is that and I suppose this is worth saying at this point in the course, my own particular interests are in my research, as it were, are in kind of connections between Sartre and the work of Deleuze and Guattari, sometimes called schizoanalysis. And so I'm kind of interested in and the reason for there being a connection is that both Guattari and Deleuze are kind of referred to Sartre as a key thinker in their background, even though they didn't really write an awful lot about him, actually. Partly possibly because they were quite close. And there's a couple of really interesting sort of moments in Transcendence of the Ego and the Emotions text that connects up with some of the stuff that Deleuze and Guattari are doing in schizoanalysis. And so that's kind of my background interest, and the thread or theme that I'm interested in there is pursuing this kind of relationship to magical thinking that we see constantly arising in these early texts of Sartre. And that connection to Deleuze and Guattari is through Deleuze and Guattari's use of sorcerers and the notion of sorcerer, particularly in 1,000 Plateaus and a chapter on becoming animal. And so that's my kind of background in terms of my agenda. But hopefully the idea is that we can kind of read Sartre. If we don't try and simplify him too much, if we don't try and simplify him to being nothingness, we can try and read Sartre slightly differently from the way he's often presented and simplified, which is as this kind of arch subjective existentialist who locates everything within the human subject and dumps on the human subject a kind of enormous responsibility that it couldn't possibly bear, either intellectually, conceptually, or in practice. And I think that kind of often that oversimplification of Sartre has led to a kind of a way of avoiding some of the more interesting stuff that is there in the early work, and that is kind of engaged with this critique of phenomenology. And all of that work, I think, is located around this attempt that he makes to use this distinction between pre-reflective and reflective. So that's the distinction that we've been kind of looking at for the last couple of sessions. It's quite a technical distinction in some ways, and it's quite kind of confusing in many ways, because you're constantly trying to double your thinking. You're trying to take consciousness in 2 kind of different ways. at the pre-reflective and at the reflectives, and so it's quite difficult to kind of get hold of all those moments and get hold of the sort of the purchase that Sartre thinks this distinction can have on other questions. But one of the ways of getting a little bit sort of more deeply into this distinction is by pursuing the way in which the emotions themselves come under Sartre's gaze, and the way in which he deploys these concepts in relationship to emotions. Now, one of the things that's kind of important here is, and this is just to continue with our discussion in some ways of unreflective behaviour, reflective behaviour, is there's this kind of very interesting notion. This is from the text The Emotions, and this is in the chapter Sketch of a Phenomenological Theory. It's this interesting notion that he says here, which you can see highlighted. I can maybe zoom in a little bit on that. There we go. Unreflective behaviour is not unconscious behaviour. Now, what should be obvious is that there's, and this is, I mean, perhaps obvious, but what should be obvious is that relationship there to the unconscious, rejection of psychoanalysis. And all the way through these texts, and in the core of the development of the argument about bad faith in being and nothingness, there is a strong rejection of psychoanalysis, a strong rejection of the concepts of the unconscious conscious. And so it's partly important because obviously we have to sort of not confuse pre-reflective, unreflective behaviour with the unconscious. So that's partly why it's important. But it's also important because it's part of the break that Sartre wants to develop when it comes to what it is to be a human being. It's part of this kind of conceptual break that he, in Being and Nothingness, describes as the break between, you know, being for itself, the kind of human being, and being in itself, you know, things in the world, stuff in the world. And why he makes this break, how he makes this break, and the different ways in which this break can be organised, the different ways in which this distinction, perhaps rather than break, can be organised, are kind of where we encounter limits and problems and interesting developments that can be sort of maybe made. So this unreflective behaviour, not being unconscious behaviour, it's essentially an attempt. This is part. Remember, I said he's always strategic. This is part of a strategic attempt to develop an account of emotions that is contrary to or displaces that of psychoanalysis and standard psychology. But one of the things we find quite curiously, in a sense, inside Sartre's work, is that we find emotion is presented as a behaviour of escape very often. And this is a very, very curious kind of idea, because obviously we don't encounter emotion as some sort of escape from something. We encounter emotion as a kind of fundamental aspect of our existence, or something that can overwhelm us, or something that we have to learn to deal with, all sorts of ways we might encounter it. But we don't generally take it as a kind of behaviour of escape. But this is an example from Sartre. This is one of the ways in which he describes it. For example, he says, take passive fear. I see a wild animal coming toward me. My legs give way, my heart beats more feebly. I turn pale, I fall and faint. Nothing seems less adapted than this behaviour which hands me over defenceless to the danger, and yet it is a behaviour of escape. Here the fainting is a refuge. Let it not be thought that this is a refuge for me, that I am trying to save myself in order not to see the wild animal anymore. I did not leave the unreflective level, but lacking power to avoid the danger by the normal methods and the deterministic links, I denied it. I wanted to annihilate it. There's a couple of key kind of moments there. Lacking power to avoid the danger by normal methods and the deterministic links. This kind of relationship to determinism is absolutely at the heart of what it is that Sartre is trying to develop. And this demand to annihilate, he said, when he says here, I wanted to annihilate it. So, you know, the person sees the animals, they kind of faint, This is a behaviour, he says, of escape. It's pre-reflective. Now, we obviously look at those kind of behaviours as something like instinctive, or something like a psychological phenomenon caused by an overwhelming, reaction in the brain or something. And in all of those explanations, all of those kind of structures of describing something, we're giving a deterministic account. We're saying this caused Y, so the stimulus of the animal caused a kind of response in the organism that is fainting, and Sartre is kind of trying to break out of this. He's trying to find a way, in a sense, to give us our freedom. That's kind of Sartre's project. All the way, it's this attempt to give us our freedom, even if we don't want it. And so instead of this kind of causal explanatory structure, this deterministic structure, which may be from instincts, it may be psychological, it may be physiological, all of those kind of remove our agency. They remove any power we have. And they place us in an entirely kind of, passive relationship to the world around us, in which we're just an effect of certain causes. And what Sartre wants to do in this description, when he says, I wanted to annihilate it, and he carries on, the urgency of the danger served as a motive for an annihilating intention. And then this is the odd thing, which demanded magical behaviour. So that word magical has all sorts of difficulties here, but it points to this idea that there was a kind of response that wasn't a stimulus response. There was a response that was still, in a sense, it was still spontaneous. It still had a degree. It is still essentially a free response. Now that seems intensely contradictory at this point. How can something like a fainting in front of an animal look like it has some sort of relationship to freedom? This kind of example looks like exactly the kind of being caught in finite causal structures that is kind of a limit to, or a kind of undermining of our freedom. Our freedom might have to work around those kind of problems, but it can't really be found in that response. That response would seem to be outside of freedom. It would seem to be somehow a different realm from the realm of freedom, and that's not what Sartre wants to allow to happen. He wants to still give the human being in these situations something like a freedom. Something like a freedom. I wanted to annihilate it, and so this attempt to escape is what produced this kind of response of fainting. And this response of fainting he's describing as a kind of magical behaviour, a kind of bringing into being through fiat, through kind of just will, almost, a new kind of world. In this situation, a world in which I'm asleep rather than awake. And so the animal obviously has, at that point, no longer in my consciousness, and I have, in a sense, changed the world around it. Obviously, from the outside, it looks ridiculous. There's a kind of logic, a kind of strange logic to what Sartre is saying. And it's that kind of strange logic that I want to kind of pursue without being friend to or enemy to, but just try and sort of work through that very strange logic. At another point, he says, let's see if I can find this one. This is another quote from him worth looking at. So I have actually, there we are. I've actually made it a little bit easier. Another point, he describes this kind of strange magical response, which sort of kind of is a kind of agency, it's a kind of freedom, and he connects it very closely to the way in which emotions operate. And he says here, we must first note that the few examples we have just cited, this is on page 70, we must first note that the few examples we have just cited are far from exhausting the variety of emotions. There can be many other kinds of fear, many other kinds of sadness. But this is the important bit. We merely state that they all are tantamount to setting up a magical world by using the body as a means of incantation. I mean, this absolutely fascinates me, this kind of relationship, because here, the kind of freedom, the freedom that's being expressed in setting up a magical world, it's not really, this is a pre-reflective freedom. This is not a reflective freedom. This is not a freedom of choice in the sense in which we commonly understand choices to be clearly defined distinct options that we can make rational cases for choosing one way or the other. So it's not they're not choices that are they're not presented to us as options, but it is presented as a creative act, as a kind of an act that is not part of the causal network. This is what the notion of magical world, or setting up a magical world, means: producing a world that is not the effect of a prior cause. And emotions are, he seems to want to say, there are many kinds of fear, many kinds of sadness. We've looked at lots of examples of emotions. We merely state, he says, that they all are tantamount to setting up a magical world by using the body as a means of incantation. So in a sense, all of those things that we think of as biological, and I think it's not uncommon for people to think of emotions as biological, all those things that we think of as in some sense outside of the realm of freedom because they're emotional states and they're produced by causes, all of these kind of things are actually trying to be reclaimed for the human being, and it's not really in its subjectivity at this point, but trying to be reclaimed for the human being in its capacity as creator. And this capacity to be able to create outside of the realm of causality is almost the kind of definition of what Sartre means by freedom. What I want to do next is, I'll just pop that off for a moment. What I want to do next is just talk about three kind of crucial concepts. Now, we've had loads of these different notions, and it's always difficult because there's always loads of these sort of concepts kicking around when you're dealing with a philosopher, and it's often difficult to keep track of them all at the same time. So I bear that in mind. But I want to sort of mention three particular kind of concepts that are kind of being important here, particularly to deal with how this idea of the emotions as kind of magical acts, as acts somehow of creativity, how it might operate. And these three concepts are projection, reflection, and affection. And by affection in particular, don't mean simply like the way in which we might say when we say someone has affection for. Affection here refers to what we might call the affect, or the emotive or mood state of somebody. And so the reflection, let's deal with the reflection concept first. Obviously, that reflection is a kind of key concept because it's the bridge line, or it's the line of differentiation between pre-reflective and reflective. And so this act of reflection is kind of crucial. It institutes that division between the pre-reflective and the reflective. And so both of those are kind of parts of the structure of reflection that is produced in a sense freely. There's no cause again. There's nothing that can prompt us. There's nothing that can cause us. There's no way in which you can press a button and force someone to reflect. These are kind of still going to be a kind of free act constituting two moments, the moment before and the moment after the institution of reflection. So reflection is a kind of crucial concept. Having these two elements, we've been discussing quite a bit, so hopefully people are relatively familiar with that. But obviously there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can pursue in terms of that, because reflection has implicit in it sets of relationships and means by which those relationships are sustained. Obviously in your everyday life, the most common place in which we encounter reflection is in the mirror, and things like light and various optical densities of the glass. All of those things are kind of crucial to, they kind of sustain those relationships of reflection. So we might ask similar questions in terms of the process of reflection with the human being. What kind of medium almost does reflection presuppose? What must be there for reflection to be able to take place? So it's not simply as straightforward as sometimes it might be, but essentially that's the concept in which the pre-reflective and the reflective are organised. The second concept is projection. Now, this is something that's much more developed inside Being and Nothingness, in which we will encounter Sartre quite commonly talking about the idea of a project. And so a project is the way in which the world and its objects are organised by the human being. And so if you're, like, let's take going to a university. If your project is to get a degree, then the world and its objects, the lecturers, the books, the tutors, the ideas, all of these kind of things are organised in terms of, this project of get a degree. And if you can get away with something that's a bit, let's say, I wouldn't say cheating, but let's say not quite in the spirit of study. So maybe you use some study notes or something, or maybe you scrounge someone's essay, you get a good grade or something. All of that kind of, providing, there's no comeback on it. Let's assume there's not going to be any comeback. All of that is kind of fine. It doesn't really alter your project. It's part of the successful organising of the world and its objects to achieve, fulfill, get you to the place in which your project kind of wants you to be. And obviously, if your project when you go to university is to study, learn, question yourself, challenge yourself, blah blah, all the kind of lovely liberal things that we're meant to really want to do at university, which, to be honest, are probably the better reasons for going to university. But if that's your project, then the very concept of, like, copying someone else's essay to try and get a grade is self-contradictory. The world, that would be a kind of contradiction in terms of the relationship that project has to the way it organises the world and its objects. And so a projection is a kind of the way in which the human being, as I say, organises the world and its objects along a kind of and it's not an instrumental line, but along the line of a project, along the line of what we might call the meaning that it's giving to the world at that particular point in time. And so, as I say, the meaning of the degree for someone the meaning of the study at college for the person who just wants the degree piece of paper is different from the meaning for the person who wants to study for more liberal arts kind of reasons of self-discovery, etc. And the third concept is this concept of affection, which, as I say, here we want to hear the word affection in terms of something like mood or quality of consciousness. And what kind of mood? So happy, sad, joyful, gloomy, these are all kind of moods, qualities of consciousness. And one of the things that we're going to encounter is that these kind of relationships between projection and affection are very, very close. Now, both projection and affection are part of what Sartre calls the non-thetic pre-reflective consciousness. That's a lovely technical term for you. Non-thetic pre-reflective consciousness. And non-thetic is just another description of pre-reflective in this situation. And non-thetic, thetic obviously sounds a bit like thesis. Yeah, sounds a bit like that kind of, putting forward of a particular claim or something. And so that's one way of maybe beginning to think about it, is that in a non-thetic situation, there's no kind of claim being put forward, made about the world around you. You're not sort of thinking anything in a reflective way. You're not thinking anything that we might traditionally think of as a conscious way, that we might be able to write into a proposition, for example. Instead, a non-thetic situation is something that we might think of as a situation of awareness, but without a conscious paying attention to that awareness. So we're not really paying attention to what we're doing when we move around the room and we don't knock into furniture, for example. But plainly there's some kind of awareness that's going on. There are famous descriptions of people driving for long distances and sort of not being able to retrieve or consciously introspect as to, where they were at each moment. So they were kind of aware of what was going on, but they weren't consciously paying attention to it. And so this is one way of us beginning to think about pre-reflective consciousness, this kind of awareness without paying attention, without conscious attention being paid. Now, one of the questions we might want to sort of look at is in this split between pre-reflective and reflective, projection and affection are going on in the mode of the pre-reflective. And one of the things we might want to ask is, are they really only going on in the mode of the pre-reflective? Is the pre-reflective a kind of continual projection onto the world of a sort of meaning and organisation of the world and its objects that depends upon the affection, the mood, or the quality of consciousness that's there? So if I'm gloomy, this is one of Sartre's examples, if I'm gloomy, then the world will take on a particular kind of meaning or gloom. If I'm joyful, the world will take on a kind of particular kind of sheen or shine, perhaps. And so the affection of the mood or the quality of consciousness organizes or is a kind of crucial ground for the projection, of the project of the kind of world that we live in. And these things are continuously taking place on the pre-reflective level. And when we move to the reflective level, it's interesting to think about whether those kind of operations can take place consciously in the same way. There's a kind of curiosity here. But what happens is that for Sartre, these different types of relations that are organized by different affections and projections, these different types of relations essentially constitute the way in which we are a being in the world and the way in which we are a being with others. And they are crucially not relationships of knowledge at the pre-reflective level. They're not relationships of knowledge. What they are instead is relationships of things like suffering or enjoying. And so that affective relationship, in a sense, produces the meaning that's then projected upon the world. And that meaning or that project then takes the world and organizes it in a particular kind of way, so that certain objects and certain events and certain actors in the world have particular kind of meanings for us, the different meanings that the lecture or the essay question might have for the student who just wants a degree, as opposed to the student who wants to challenge themselves and think about the implications of it for their own world. And so we end up with this kind of notion of something like knowledge relations in particular taking place at the reflective level. And at the pre-reflective level, a kind of an affective, projective organization of a suffering affect producing a tragic world, or an enjoying, an affect of enjoyment, maybe producing a joyful world. Projections give us a world, he says, that can be cruel, terrible, gloomy, joyful, etc. So there's a whole sort of sense in which the world itself takes on the qualities that I am sort of giving it, in a sense. And so my projection is ultimately and intimately connected with my affection. My mood, in a sense, colours the world. I mean, this is perhaps not that difficult for us to get to grips with. The idea of rose-tinted glasses. We kind of know that, certain ways of being, certain affective states, certain, ways in which we, are being in the world. So let's say someone who's extrovert or joyful produces and organizes the world so that they have a different kind of being with others. They will have, the extroverted relationship with others rather than the introverted, perhaps. And so emotions are kind of part of this relationship of projection and affection. And so they're kind of organized very heavily, particularly a lot of the discussion around this kind of setup of projections grounded upon affections, so meanings projected onto the world on the basis of the mood that we're in, crudely put. But done so in this non-thetic way. In other words, it's done so with a kind of awareness, but not by paying attention, but not an awareness that has any conscious attention paid to it. So we kind of get on with it without really thinking about it. We live it rather than think it. So if emotions are kind of organised like that, one of the things that Sartre discusses is the problem of mimicry. And the problem of people, in a sense, being able to act. Obviously, this is crucial. When we encounter the storytelling in movies and in books and in novels and in plays and in situations even around us a little bit, sometimes in social situations, there's this kind of constant awareness that the emotion is mimicked. That's a kind of curious word, because obviously there might be some. I mean, it might be argued, for example, that the actor is instantiating an emotion rather than mimicking it. So they're kind of bringing the emotion forth rather than mimicking it. So there's something a little bit suspect about what Sartre is saying here, because he seems to be almost presenting acting as a kind of falsity or presenting of a falsehood, which could be challenged, I think, quite intimately. But this relationship to emotions in which we know that they can be feigned, that the emotional state that we encounter may actually be a lie, it may actually be a falsehood, it may be a cover, Those kind of things present us with this curious way in which emotions can't simply be, as it were, at a pre-reflective level, or it looks difficult for them to just be at a pre-reflective level, particularly when we encounter this kind of falsehood or the false, mimicked emotion, the acted situation. I'll return to that in a couple of minutes. Let's have a 5-minute break because it's past, and I think it's a good idea to have a little break. So grab yourself a glass of water, have a walk around, stretch your legs, whatever you need to do. But have a 5-minute break, and I'll return at 25 to. Okay. Oops. Okay, let's start again. So I was just saying that there's this kind of intimate connection, understanding of emotions as part of this relationship between projection and affection. Something interesting about this in that it seems to be located in the kind of pre-reflective realm primarily, and it's worth thinking about whether we can have reflective emotions or reflective projections, whether we can literally, as it were, think a kind of a sort of set of meanings of the world that we can project onto it and make it work. And one of the difficulties with that is perhaps that when we think of like a reflective projection onto the world, or a reflective attempt, in other words, a kind of what we think of as conscious, more traditionally, a way in which I kind of think myself into a situation. What it sounds a bit like is, have happy thoughts and you'll have a happy life, think good thought kind of ideas, positivity, the power of positive thinking and all this kind of stuff. Now, obviously, that's very closely connected to the way in which Sartre is describing it, in a sense, because he's using this notion of the magical connection, the body as an incantation tool. He's using this to kind of describe this relationship of emotions, but it's not in a clearly positive way. There's a kind of ambiguity, crucial ambiguity, I think. This might have to be disputed, but there seems to be a crucial ambiguity in the way in which he's deploying this idea of magical. In a sense, it's not as successful, it's not as powerful, it's not as rationally clear as what we might do at a reflective level, and at the same time, it's also a kind of source of creativity and freedom. It kind of shows our freedom. And so we're faced with a kind of situation in which our descriptions of emotions usually, give us a sense of those emotions not being things under our control. And as soon as we put that idea of it not being under control, not being under our control, not being under conscious control, emotions are outside of conscious control. If we think that about emotions, then we obviously give up any sort of relationship of agency in terms of, well, not any sense of agency. There's a limit placed upon our agency in relationship to those things, in relationship to those emotions. They're going to cause us to behave in certain sorts of ways, let's say. And I can't, and I'm maybe able to claim that I'm not responsible for what I said because I was angry or something like this. And this is, as we saw, in Transcendence of the Ego, for Sartre, this is a way of avoiding and getting backwards the way in which things are being organised. And I think what Sartre does when he uses this idea of emotions, and when he brings up this kind of concept of the mimicking of emotions, the kind of way in which an actor might mimic an emotion, or the way in which a liar might mimic an emotion, he kind of presents this kind of problem of, well, what's a true emotion? If there's a mimicry, if there's a kind of simulacra, if there's a simulation of something, what's the thing it's simulating, and what's that actually like? And here's another kind of important formula. Let's again look back at the text. There's another kind of important formula that Sartre then uses, and here, true emotion is quite otherwise. It is accompanied by belief. And for those of you who were here when we were doing Fear and Trembling, hopefully you can begin now, having gone through a lot of this technical stuff. This is the first hint of some of the connections that we might be able to make between this quite technical relationship to consciousness that Sartre is developing in Transcendence of the Ego and then in the Emotions, this quite technical relationship to consciousness, and the much more emotive, poetic relationship to freedom, faith, belief that Kierkegaard is discussing and describing and thinking through inside Fear and Trembling. So true emotion for Sartre is quite otherwise than just a simple mimicry. It's accompanied by belief, and he describes it in the way in which we might kind of quite normally understand emotion in some sense in our standard everyday life. So this is the encounter with the horrible. In order for us, this is Sartre, in order for us to truly grasp the horrible, it is not only necessary to mimic it, we must be spellbound, flooded by our own emotion. And we cannot stop it. It exhausts itself, he says. Emotions are something that are undergone. And he wants to maintain this kind of character of the emotion being undergone. And so for most of us, that would perhaps be most quickly understood as somehow we're undergoing our body, something our body is doing to us, as it were, and our body is responding to signals and stimulus that are kind of outside of our control, and it's producing responses that are kind of outside of our control, and we have to kind of undergo it. We have to kind of put up with it. But he repeats a number of times, and it's kind of crucial in this sort of section of the emotions, this relationship between emotion and belief. Emotion is a phenomena of belief, he describes a couple of pages later. If you look at what he does here, though, in order for us to truly grasp the horrible, it is not only necessary to mimic it, we must be spellbound, flooded by our own emotion. Continues, the formal frame of the behaviour, in other words, that something looks horrible or seems to be horrible, must be filled with something opaque and heavy which serves as matter. So this is him attempting to encounter and give back to our intuitions of emotions, that which we think we've got by giving over to the body the causal power in this situation. So we're going to keep that causal power with us. We're going to stay, in a sense, saying that the emotions are somehow free responses, confused if not, but somehow free. But we're going to kind of want to give them back this weight. And so, as he says, the formal frame of the behaviour must be filled with something opaque and heavy which serves as matter, serves as that which is going to give it its weight on us. We understand in this situation the role of purely physiological phenomena. In other words, the role of those bodily phenomena. They represent the seriousness of the emotion. They are phenomena of belief. They should certainly not be separated from behaviour, he goes on, and various other things, but that notion, they represent, so these kind of physiological responses, the body responses, those kind of things that we think of as outside of our subjectivity, outside of our control. We might be able to train them through habits or something. We might be able to sort of get used to them and be able to sort of manipulate them a bit, but basically they're kind of this other force inside us. The id, nature, the animal, whatever force it is you want to sort of say that we are kind of subject to. That's all of which Sartre is trying to kind of push that aside and reorganize our account of emotions. And so the purely physiological phenomena, those kind of, if we see something horrifying, the kind of scary racing of the heart and perspiration and the hair standing up on end and all these kind of things, these aren't physiological responses primarily. Primarily they're actually effects, or they're caused by the seriousness of the emotion. And that is tied into the seriousness of belief, the depth of belief. So the more I believe the thing, the more I believe the situation, the more that physiological response is going to occur. Page 75, a couple of pages later, let's look at this. Emotion, as again, this is the second time he says this, is a phenomena of belief. Consciousness does not limit itself to projecting affective signification upon the world around it. It lives the new world which it has just established. So consciousness does not limit itself to projecting affective signification upon the world around it. So that's that connection between projection and affection that I was talking about in the first half. This kind of way in which your mood is connected into a projection of meaning onto the world, affective signification, so giving the world a tone of being gloomy or joyful, etc. But consciousness does not limit itself to this. It lives the new world which it has just established. So let's have an example then. He gives this example, a face on a window. So let's describe this. Let's think about this. We're sitting, it's an evening, maybe, we're chilling out and reading some Sartre, and we've got our front window that's on the street, and and someone's face is suddenly at that window, and it's lit, maybe in such a way, lit from below. It's all shadows and dark, and as we catch sight of this, the heart leaps. we see, just this face, and we see a kind of, terrifying moment of someone invading our space, possibly threatening us, and we're frightened. I mean, this is a relatively easy kind of example for us to think about. And so what we have to think about here is the transition, okay, and that kind of production of that situation. How am I made to be frightened? Why am I in that situation frightened? Now, if we, this is Sartre, if we give to other things in the world, if we give to the world in itself a kind of cause for my fright, then we end up with all sorts of strange problems. We end up with the problem of me being essentially just, without any kind of capacity or agency. I'm just a kind of, buffeted around like a plant, or an animal, or, a piece of flotsam in the ocean. But also, I'm produced in this situation where perhaps the thing isn't actually frightening. I may have been mistaken. And so in that situation, what's occurring? Am I just a fool? Have my responses somehow been hyperactivated because of evolutionary psychological dynamics that have occurred, and so that I'm kind of primed to respond in this kind of way, and again, I've got no responsibility for it. What Sartre wants to try and develop is an account in which those explanations which push against our freedom can be kind of strategically avoided in that implication of removing our freedom. And this is kind of his strategic move, to try and not give in to those explanations each time they try and take away our freedom, our capacity to produce, our capacity to creatively respond to the world. And so in that face at the window, in that kind of situation, for him, in the transition from like, quietly reading my Sartre in the evening to suddenly being frightened by the face at the window, I've, for Sartre, produced a new world. Okay, so the affective relationship there has kind of reorganized the world, and objects that previously had, he describes this quite nicely. Objects that previously had one kind of meaning now have another one. So the distance between me and the window is instead not previously it might have been thought of as a distance, and now it's a closeness, it's a contact. It's reorganized from the window is over there to a closeness and an intimacy as soon as that face appears. The window itself, instead of being something that is a kind of barrier or border between the outside and the inside, becomes a way in which the face is actually framed. So it becomes the kind of space in which the fright is occurring. And the crucial point here, and this is the crucial point that's difficult, is that this is kind of a pre-reflective response, but it's not a caused response. It could be otherwise. It's not necessary, and that, I think, is the bit that's kind of difficult to sometimes get to, because we're going to be able to come up with examples in which we can't really see how our responses couldn't be, necessarily the way they were. But the qualities of the objects that are occurring in this situation, let's say in the situation of the person who's sort of absorbed in their book and then sees the face at the window and is frightened, the qualities of those objects, such as the face at the window, are not subjective. Their cause does not lie in me either, in a straight sense. I am not causing the objects to occur. What I'm doing is I'm kind of in a kind of continual loop between the way in which I'm encountering the world and the way in which the world is giving itself back to me. The qualities are not subjective, and we can have a couple of reasons that Sartre would ask us to sort of put forward for that. The first reason, obviously, is that the pre-reflective mode, which is, let's say, how we're encountering the frightening face, is pre-personal. Okay, so it's prior to the existence of me as an I, remember. Although I can say I at a certain point, that's when I move to the reflective level. In that situation, that response of being frightened is pre-reflective and therefore pre-personal. And it's a kind of response that someone would have. Someone, generally, a pre-personal situation, somebody, some person could have this response. And we kind of know this because there are certain ways in which we can frighten people. And we can do it as a joke. When people do this as a joke, and they stand behind doors and they shout as you come through the door, and everyone gets, the person gets frightened. But the other reason that they're not subjective is, and this is the more kind of interesting one and complicated one, and perhaps the one that gets Sartre into kind of problems, is that whilst the light cast at the objects may change, with the reorganization of the way in which the objects are. The object must still be able to respond to the different light. And so if there's no way in which that face could ever look frightening, then it's not going to be able to respond. So I might be frightened for a moment, but the face itself would dissolve that fright. That face at the window that I'm frightened of must be capable of sustaining, at least for a while, and being able to be seen in that way for it to be able to be given that meaning. So it's not about us being able to arbitrarily produce meaning in the world, and somehow therefore create a subjective world for us. Rather, it's about us in this kind of interactive relationship with the world, having a particular project, a particular way in which we see the world as meaningful, and that kind of being able to be responded to by the world. So in some ways we can kind of, I think of this a little bit like the different ways in which, light is shown upon an object. And if you play around with the kind of lights that you play onto an object, so if you've got a red object and you show different colors onto it and you try and take pictures of that, you will get different colors than red from the object. But that object needs to be able to kind of respond to those different colors in different ways to give us those variations. Now, one of the challenges that's made to Sartre is that he's reducing emotions to kind of choices. Now, that's plainly not what he wants to do in the text. That doesn't mean he doesn't do it, but it's plainly not what he wants to do. The emotion, for example, is not simply a case of switching something on or off. I've just sort of described in one way why that might not be the case. And again, remember that it's accompanied by belief. But we do seem to encounter a kind of vicious circle that we can be in, where the world seems as I see it or as I believe it. And this kind of vicious circle can not look particularly positive. It does look in a sense like we're kind of trapped again almost. And so the question would be, in that situation, if I'm trapped, there's no choices. And if there is a choice, then I'm not trapped. And so Sartre doesn't want us to be trapped. And so there's this constant sort of idea that Sartre is somehow reducing emotions to choice. Now, Sartre is going to be able to push back at this a little bit, because even in that vicious circle where I might be trapped, reflection is always possible. The eye can always accompany, for example, these situations. We can ask whether it is possible actually in some situations, whether, placed in situations of being utterly overwhelmed, whether there's any real possibility of being, able to step aside and move into a process of reflection. But one of the things that also follows closely on from this kind of idea that Sartre sort of might push that reflection is always possible is that responsibility follows close behind. And so this is kind of pushing back to some of the things we were talking about a little while ago, where Sartre's notion of freedom is very closely connected to something like a concept of responsibility. And once we bring forward this idea of responsibility that arises from the capacity to reflect and the fact that we aren't actually trapped inside our emotional vicious circle, the way in which the way in which the world seems just because I see it in a particular way, the way in which it seems because I believe it in a particular way. Once we acknowledge we're not kind of trapped on that because the reflection is always possible, and this responsibility then begins to follow close behind, what we encounter precisely are the ways in which that responsibility is avoided, and we encounter the strategies of avoidance and escape, which are strategies that psychoanalysis describes, in terms of things like repression and secondary repressions and whole sorts of, structure of psychic phenomena, but which Sartre wants to describe without, again, relying upon causal structures. What Sartre wants to describe in such a way that we still have our freedom at the heart of this. And despite the fact that we might escape or want to avoid our freedom, nevertheless, that freedom is still there, and he's trying to present all these different ways in which, there's a kind of what he calls transcendental arguments. The condition for a whole series of our behaviours is that we are free and creative and capable of responding differently. And that avoidance and escape, the primary strategy of that is bad faith. That's why next week we'll be looking at bad faith. Now, I want to just briefly go over a quote that I gave, I think, in the last session, and this is Sartre, and this is again to try and push us to think about the way in which he's conceiving of freedom, particularly in terms of the emotions, but also in terms just more generally. So the idea, this is Sartre, the idea which I have never ceased to develop is that in the end one is always responsible for what is made of one. Okay, so even then we've got a complication. We are always responsible for what is made of one, even if one can do nothing else besides assume this responsibility. For I believe that a man can always make something out of what is made of him. This is the limit I would today accord to freedom, the small movement which makes of a totally conditioned social being someone who does not render back completely what his conditioning has given him, which makes of Genet a poet when he had been rigorously conditioned to be a thief. So he's not denying conditioning. He's not trying to argue against all of the kind of social impositions of norms and values and behaviours and ways in which we're habitually kind of brought up to operate and behave. But what he is saying is that none of these at any point take away the possibility of responsibility, the possibility of taking responsibility for these, the possibility of making something out of them. And I think this is kind of, this possibility is kind of crucial. For Sartre, freedom is a breach of the causal determinative structure. It can't be anything other than that. So there can't be a kind of, cause of freedom. And freedom is, in a sense, best described, I think, for Sartre as not determinism. It's the negation of determinism. It's this constant capacity to create in the face of a whole series of things that want to organise and determine us and make us into something. And it's also important to remember that the opposite of freedom is not determinism for Sartre, it's fate or fatalism. And this is kind of absolutely crucial for us to begin to get a grip on what he means by freedom, which is not everywhere but can never be removed for the human being. That's kind of the issue there. So let's take a situation of cause and effect. X must happen because Y. So Y here is the cause. Y causes X. X must happen because Y. Y causes X. And there's two ways in which we can kind of respond to those situations. Now fatalism, that X is going to have to happen. Fatalism is a kind of submission to the connection between the cause and the effect. It's a kind of acceptance of this causal relationship. That's fatalism. Determinism is the kind of meta-theoretical structure of how things work, and fatalism kind of would have, a response, and is a response to determinism, but determinism, isn't the only way in which things are connected by some sort of cause and effect relationship. The gods played with people, and there was a cause of people's behaviours that was, located in the gods and in sort of destiny. And fatalism is this submission, accept your destiny. That's a kind of destruction of freedom. Accept your destiny. This is fatalism. Submit to the way in which the world is. Submit to the fact that this is how things work. There is nothing you can do about this, etc., etc., etc. There is no alternative. Whereas freedom is the refusal of this. I mean, that's essentially it. It's that capacity to go, no, fuck off, no, absolutely not, fuck off, no. And that's kind of it at its root, but it's far more creative. It's far more interesting than just a simple no. It's a refusal, and this capacity to negate. And this is Sartre's thing that he's going to develop all the way through Being and Nothingness. This refusal, this capacity to negate, is our freedom. And in that capacity to negate, we can begin to take responsibility. But this means that there are no more explanations for human behaviour. There are instead, we might call, exculpations. It's excuses. To exculpate is to free yourself from responsibility. So in Latin, ex and culpare. Culpare means to blame. Exculpare means to avoid blame. And so, in fact, what Sartre, I think, argues is that instead of explanations, what we're constantly producing are exculpations, where we try and free ourselves from responsibility. And bad faith is, as it were, a general mode of exculpation. It's a kind of generalized structure in which we try and avoid or flee or free from responsibility, avoiding guilt or blame. And we flee our freedom in that situation because responsibility becomes too appalling. Now, perhaps we need to begin to look at that next time in terms of what question is that answer? Why is this idea of fleeing freedom, exculpation, bad faith, avoidance, escape from responsibility. Why is that so central? What is it that Sartre is trying to encounter and deal with when he constantly kind of refers to this this non-causal relationship, and where he constantly tries to remove the capacity to explain and reduce things, as I say, to exculpations? What is it that he's trying to deal with? What's his problem? Okay, I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much. If you're around on the stream, I will be opening up the Zoom seminar room for Free University Brighton people next week. Reading for the seminar will be the chapter on bad faith in being and nothingness, and I'll be talking about a little bit about in the lecture as well, so if you want to follow along you can do that. And that's going to be the end of the stream for tonight. The Zoom room will be open, but it will be about 5 minutes before we start there, so again, take a break and you can grab yourself a drink or whatever. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week. There will be one more session next week on this course. I'll see you next week.